Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Cancer moon as the luminary out of Sect, I speak with the brilliant Jared Williams. We spoke about the placement of Jared's moon in the first whole sign house, but we also covered a lot of other ground. We actually talked a lot about astronomical and scientific concepts in this episode, such as barycenters, especially as they relate to the relationship of the sun and the planets, as well as of the earth and the moon. In addition, we talked about thermal lag in relation to the sun's domicile of Leo and the sign of Cancer, as well as the sun's joy in the ninth house. We also talked a bit about the nodes, not only of the moon, but also of the other planets, as well as the sun. In addition, we talked about the relationship of the moon and Jupiter astrologically, and finished our conversation with a poignant discussion on death, meaning, and what it fundamentally means to do astrology. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm offering natal and timing consultations as well as answering horary questions. I also offer transcription, captioning, and audio and video editing. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support. I really appreciate you. Now for my conversation with Jared. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check out the links to his website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. Jared, thank you so much for coming and being on the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Hi, SP. It's great to see you.
Good to see you as well. And you are on vacation right now off of a trip to Norwalk?
Yeah, that's correct. I kind of crashed Norwalk last weekend, so I just kind of like vibed around on the lawn of the hotel, which was super great, and it was great to see everybody. And then that was the holiday weekend, and then had a short week of work, and then went on vacation, and now I'm on the Oregon coast, just kind of like vibing on the beach, doing nothing else.
Love it. Perfect for a Cancer moon episode.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. I'm just reminded last year of doing the same thing where we were vibing on the lawn outside of the Hilton?
The double tree.
The double tree. There we go. When Norwalk happens. And I wish I had met this person after. I've never had contact with them again, but they were dressed in like a floral getup, and my crew of people, we were all dressed in black, and they were like, "Okay, Saturnian crew," and they were like, "We're the Venusians over here," and I was like, "Wow, this is so funny." Love.
Truly, I showed up as like Venusian, and people kept commenting on it because it was Saturday when I was there, and everybody was wearing black, and I showed up in like a green jumpsuit. I was like, and I thought about it that morning. I was like, do I wear black? And I was like, you know what, like, Taurus is my 11th house, and that's like what I'm about to do, is like go see my friends. So yeah. I'm gonna dress like my chart.
Heck yeah, love it. I love that too, because I've been recently over the past few months trying to do like planetary wear for the different days of the week. So on Friday, like I got like green shorts and like a green kind of shirt as well, and it's like feels like too much green, but I'm just like, we're going for it.
Yeah, gonna do it. Yep.
Yeah, and you said that you didn't go to lectures, but you're hoping to, or you're planning to buy some. What's kind of catching your eye, if you don't mind sharing?
So I'm really excited for Gray Crawford's lecture. Like, I'm a student of Gray's, and I'm excited to see his lecture, and I'm excited to see Austin's lectures. Austin's also one of my teachers, so I'll be watching their lectures for sure. Specifically, I'm looking forward to watching Austin's lectures on the Ptolemaic years of man as kind of the marking posts, just because like that's something that I use in my practice, and I'm excited to like see his take on it.
Yeah.
And I use it in my practice in the way, like, it's pretty important because, you know, if you use the Abu Mashar method, Abu Mashar talks about like using other timing techniques, like before you even get to perfections. That's like book 1 of Solar Revolutions. Right. So it's cool to start seeing, and like that, I feel like everybody is kind of on the perfections train. And so it's kind of cool to see like more of that like what I would call pre-work for that being like expanded on right now. I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah. As you probably know, I'm pretty excited about that as well. Like kind of couching the annual perfections in these kind of epoch lord techniques, which are, myriad as well. Very cool. Yeah. So let's get into you just giving a brief introduction to yourself, your practice, your viewpoint, your teachers.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been formally studying astrology since, I guess it would be the end of 2019. It was the 2020 astrology forecast episode of the astrology podcast that like the algorithm showed me. And I was kind of like struck with how technical it all was. Like it, up until that point, my exposure to astrology was very like horoscope in the newspaper kind of situation, which like is great, but it like wasn't like it sometimes hit and sometimes was kind of like, okay, thanks. But that was like they were looking at things like very technically and like walking through things very systematically. And I was kind of like struck in awe by that. And then I, in 2020, signed up for Austin Kopic's year one course and took that. And I've taken his year one and year two course, and I'm currently in his year three course. And so, yeah, like that. So that, I would call Austin kind of like my primary teacher formally. But yeah, my astrology is really, I entered into it using the Hellenistic techniques. I kind of bypassed like modern astrology and jumped right into the Hellenistic techniques, and which has been like a really fun way to experience astrology.
Yeah.
And yeah, like that's kind of my foundation of it.
Yeah, I relate to that a lot because like I learned astrology basically like by watching the astrology podcast, by reading Demetrius books, like coming in from this kind of Hellenistic framework. So like I don't really understand like the natural zodiac. I don't understand kind of like the houses as signs kind of system, which a lot of people they kind of come in this modern way. So it's really interesting that like astrology has kind of developed so much over the last few decades that there are people like you and I who are coming in and learning this completely different kind of school of thought.
Yeah, and it's and it's pretty new. And if you talk to most astrologers, I would say that most astrologers did not come into astrology with ancient astrology as like kind of the first step. And it definitely, there's a gap, and we have a lot to learn from each other. And I try to remind myself of that, but also, it's okay to be critical of things and for things to just be like, and my whole process is like, well, where did that come from? Like, what is your source for that? And often it's, I don't know. I don't find the sources sufficient, maybe. And maybe that's just me, but I don't know. That's a big digression.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a student of philosophy and the history of philosophy, I really resonate with that, and I do think that it's interesting to look at even the medieval Islamic, kind of 8th, 9th century astrologers in like the kind of modern day Iraq or what have you, and like they are kind of faithfully building upon Hellenistic sources and Indic sources, and so there is a real respect for the past and kind of like an evolution of that, for lack of a better term. And it's like, yeah, a lot of things literally get lost in translation between, the Greek world to, the Arabic world to back to, Europe in the Renaissance and kind of into modern times. So, and a lot of that work I think is still being done. Yeah, but I respect that.
And I mean, I think if you like the revival of these ancient techniques is a relatively like modern thing. And I think about the way that people have used things like essential dignity in a modern context, where I just really don't think we understand why essential dignity is what it is enough for us to be messing with that system. Right. Like, I don't think we don't have like kind of the concept like we still don't understand like why the bounds are assigned the way that they are. We still don't understand like, so like kind of the structure of the zodiac, you know, we have kind of these sources about like, you know, the thema mundi, for example, being kind of like the framework for essential dignity and like the domicile scheme. But then we don't, you know, we have a lot of theories on like why the exaltation scheme is the way that it is. And a lot of theories on why the triplicity schemes and the multiplicity schemes. And it just, I don't think that we have a full enough understanding of those systems for us to be like in a modern context, really like expanding on them in a real way. And that's why I think a lot of that, and I think that's really where I was struck when I came into astrology, when I did, was it was with people who I think were admittedly saying like, well, we don't have all of the information yet. Like this is us trying to piece it together with the information that we do have. Yeah. And I've muted the outer planets on my Twitter feed.
They don't exist to me now.
Exactly. I can't see them.
Amazing. I just want to give listeners some context about how we know each other, because I feel like that helps kind of frame the conversation. I'm a big fan of your podcast. I've also had your co-host John on the show to talk about their Aquarius moon, and we've, you know, just a shout out to people who are maybe new students, kind of like myself. You know, I'm still a relatively new student, for the importance of trades, because doing, you know, you and I have done a number of trades, and you recently kind of like, you know, did an actual session with me. And it's funny because you originally reached out to me and were like, hey, I'd like to buy a session from you. And I was like, no, let's do a trade. Let's do a trade instead. And part of that was like I think a lack of confidence on my part, but part of it was like knowing that you being a more kind of learned and more seasoned practitioner, that I was going to get some value from watching you work. And so that was more important to me than the money. And, you know, so I think that I definitely want to give a shout out to just like doing trades with people. And I think Astro Twitter can be problematic in some ways and difficult in some ways, but I think the connections that it does form, like the genuine connections it can form, can be really helpful in our learning journeys, and are just kind of having people to speak the language with. So
I agree. And yeah, so that's exactly how we know each other from, is Astro Twitter, and just kind of like interacting with each other on the Twitter sphere, and doing chart trades. And I did get a year ahead reading from you, because I started to do the math, and I was like, you know what? I have friends who would love to do this math for me. And so yeah, and shout out to Kira Taborn for like bringing us all together in the Twitter sphere, really.
Yes.
So like, you know, John, Deja, and I met through the 11th house, which was like her thing that she had before she currently has Joe's house. She's, you know, currently doing that, where she's connecting people in social media. And I think the chart trades that she does is like a really great way. So like shout out to her for like another like person that I would consider a teacher of mine, of like, you know, especially she's kind of like my social astro teacher of like how to behave online. So
she's like the social chair of the Astro
100% of Astro Twitter
that we're all in. Yeah, for those people who have a hard time maybe like organically making the connections, I think that doing something like Jove's House is a really good way to, you know, you just pay $11 a month. It's super affordable, and you have an opportunity each month to do trades with other people that want to do trades. And so that's a really good, I think, avenue to go down as well.
Definitely. Yeah. That, I mean, that's, I wouldn't have the podcast, which like at some point my goal on this vacation is to edit the Taurus forecast season, like episode, and post it, just because I think it'll be funny to like mid Gemini season be like, hey, the Taurus forecast is up. And yeah, so which I was telling everybody I did, I was going to do that around Norwalk, but then I just did Norwalk instead. There hasn't been an episode since before Taurus season. We did like, yeah, it's been a minute. We've all been busy. It was like Norwalk season, and now vacation, and like Pride, and we're all doing stuff. So
Yeah, it's like podcasting is actually, not to get off on a total tangent because we need to stick to the task at hand, but podcasting is kind of low key a lot harder than people think it is.
Yeah.
It's like I was up till 12:30, like I was up till past midnight last night just making sure I had my episode edited so that I could release it this morning with the Gemini Moon episode I did with Rob Bailey. And it's just like, with like the recording and then like editing really does take a lot of time, and thinking about social media and how you support that. And it is really a lot of work. And I want to encourage people to do astrology podcasts because I think it can be really beneficial, but I also want people to go into it with the knowledge of like, this is not just going to be like, you talk to your friends for an hour and then like, that's all the work that you're doing. There's a lot more that goes into it. So got to let my capstellium speak for a second there.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's like, our podcast is very much like get on with your friends and turn on the microphone. But then the danger of that is it's like, I can't post all of that.
Yeah.
Like there is no way in hell. And then you end up having to like edit, and then you have to find that one reference, at 48 minutes where you reference the thing that you had to cut out at 3 minutes. And
yeah, it's very entangled very quickly.
Yes.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. So to get into talking about the moon, I would love to hear about your relationship with the moon before you were, a diviner, before you were an astrologer and a practitioner. Did you have a relationship with the moon when you were a kid, or is there like a particular memory that comes to mind when you like realized the moon was like this thing in the sky?
Yeah. So I've always been kind of like fascinated with the night sky and the sky in general. So like I was like always really into like the astronomy unit when we had that in science in classes as a kid, and like the astronomy merit badge when I was in Boy Scouts as a kid. And so things like the moon phases and how they work, and the solar system and the stars, and like, how they move, like those are things that I just like remember learning in school, and like remember like still have like the knowledge that I remember learning in school of them. And then like I also, so like I'm a musical person, like I've always been involved with music. And there was like I was exposed pretty early to an artist named Arnold Schoenberg, a composer named Arnold Schoenberg, who is he's a 20th century composer who composed this piece called Piero Lunaire, and that's the piece that I was like exposed to as a kid. And it's an atonal piece, so it's like doesn't really have like a tonic form. It doesn't like resolve itself. It feels very unresolved, and it uses this technique called Sprechstimme, which is like spoken song. And it's like kind of an early, like it's like a textbook example of that technique. And it's like about this like clown that goes mad under the moonlight. And like that's like what the poetry is. And so it's like very dark, very spooky. But I remember being like 5 and like being obsessed with it, and like listening to this like weird German art piece like over and over and over again, and like listening to it in the car. I've reflected on it as an adult, and it's very like, it is very lunar in that like even the technique of Sprechstimme is like there's notes, but it's meant to imitate speaking, and it feels very like intense, which I feel like the moon is, and it feels very like kind of bestial, which I feel like is very lunar. Like it's just like you can't control what's being said. It's like almost like shouted. Yeah. And the poetry is about like being struck with moonlight, like on your clothes, and like thinking that it's like plaster, and like scratching your skin off because you think that the moonlight is like plaster on your skin. And so like that's the text of it. And so yeah, like it's like that's been kind of my relationship with the moon. It's just like always kind of in awe of it and like just like aware of it. Like I feel like I've always been like know where it is, and like always saw it, and even seeing it during the day, which like I'm a day moon. And like I've always been kind of the person that's like, oh look, the moon, like even before astrology was like a thing.
It's interesting, you brought up Kira earlier, and Kira also expressed in childhood like almost kind of like a a fear associated with seeing the moon rise and like being enormous and being like, holy shit.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that like you also have a day chart and you're expressing this kind of referencing this work that's very lunar, but is like there are these kind of ominous undertones or overtones or what have you. And like it reminds me of the fact that I have my moon in the first and I'm a night chart, and like the moon music that I kind of have with for this podcast is like Claire de Lune. It's so like sweet and like nice, you know. It's very, very interesting. And it also kind of reminds me, you know, when you mentioned clowns, it reminds me of Saturn and Saturn's kind of traditional rulership of clowns and the oppositional relationship that Saturn and the moon can have. You know, like literally the domicile of Saturn and the domicile of the moon are opposite each other. And but there's also these interesting resonances in timing with a Saturn cycle and a progressed lunar cycle being around the same time.
Yep. 28 days and 28 years being kind of the same, just like on different scale. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. And there is something about like you having this like moon in your first Cancer rising day chart that also felt resonant with what you were talking about, but I kind of lost the thought. So,
well, and it's, you know, I have that moon Saturn like opposition in the chart. It's like they are very opposite one another in my chart. And then it's interesting because the other planet involved in that configuration really tightly is Venus. So it's like, oh, but we're gonna make it art. Like there's this like weird creepy moon thing happening, but like it's artistic.
We can frame this in some kind of beautiful aesthetic way.
Yeah. Amazing. And it's very I would call it like academic art. So like Arnold Schoenberg was primarily a music theorist. And actually yesterday when I was in Portland, I went to a bookstore and I found like a used copy of a translation of his book on tonal theory. And so like I'm like really excited to like dig into that. And there's like a whole section on like chords built on the church modes, which I have a whole kind of thing with the planets and the church modes that's like forming in my brain. So I'm like kind of starting to explore that. And also Arnold Schoenberg like was an astrologer, and not necessarily in that he practiced astrology, but that he like sought the advice of astrologers. And that's like known in his life. And he was like definitely a mystic. And so like that was, just to kind of like go back to that is like, that's my experience with the moon.
Yeah. And you also have Venus in your ninth. So it feels very
it's like
resonant.
Academic. Yeah.
Very cool.
Thank you. Cause that's like where I was going with that. And I lost that train of thought, getting excited about talking about Schoenberg.
Yeah. I try not to like talk too much about the guest chart because I want them to kind of talk about it on their own. I don't want to reveal too much, but there are some things that are just so striking that can't not mention it. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your relationship with the moon today, how that's evolved over time, and also like the importance of the moon just in your personal astrological practice?
Oh yeah, the moon's everything. So like the moon is like so unique astronomically and astrologically. So like when we're thinking about an astrological chart and everything that's in it, and the sun and the angles and the planets, like these are, so like obviously the sun is the center of our solar system and we orbit the sun and all the planets orbit the sun. We actually don't. We orbit each other. There's a barycenter that we orbit around, and sometimes that's outside of the body of the sun when Jupiter and Saturn are aligned, which is very interesting. But it's the same with the moon, right? So, but the moon is in this astrology chart because it's this very visible object in our sky, but it's ours. It belongs to the Earth. We orbit each other. The moon and the Earth orbit each other. We don't. So like I want to clarify that like the moon doesn't orbit us. Like the moon and Earth orbit one another around a point that moves beneath the Earth's crust. But it's not the center of the Earth. It's just beneath the Earth's crust, because that's how orbital dynamics work. And what that means is that like we're not, it's not just that us, cruising through the sky with the moon going around us. It's like, we're kind of doing this stirring motion with the moon. which is like really intense, right? Like it actually like has an impact on our earth. Like we like the atmosphere like bulges toward the moon when like where she is. And so like it's no other planet besides the sun, which is the thing that we belong to, right? Like no other planet has that level of impact on us. So yeah, like and then truly because the moon is ours, she's the thing that's closest to the other things for us, right? So that they don't come directly to us, they come to us, they hit her first. And then comes, down to us from there. So that's why, if you think about things like electional astrology and things like horary astrology, looking at like what is the moon connecting to is like really important because like she's the thing that it's a natural satellite. Like what do satellites do? They like pick up transmissions and send them elsewhere. So like that's her role for us.
Amazing. I love like all the astronomical knowledge that you're bringing in. I feel like it adds like a real richness to the astrology.
Yeah, like, and that's I think kind of my whole framework around how I practice all of it is that like if you don't divorce the two, like it's very easy to like derive meaning from what they are actually doing astronomically. We don't have to just implant arbitrary meaning on them. We can actually observe and be like, oh, the earth is actually like bulging toward the moon, like in some way. And like the moon and the sun affect our tides. Like both of those bodies pull on the earth in a way that makes us pull, like physically, if they are affecting our tides, that is like the things on the earth moving toward that body. They like actually pull on us.
Yeah, it's like kind of amazing to think about, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does Cancer mean to you as a sign, and are there any considerations of myth that come in with your understanding of that sign or your experience of either the moon or the sign of Cancer?
Yeah, it is the height of the zodiac. So it's where when in the northern hemisphere, it is the most overhead point when the sun is there or when any planet is there. It's about as far north as it'll get. And that means it's about as far overhead as it'll get.
Right.
And so that's, I think, really important with Cancer is that it's the height of the zodiac. And I think one of the things that I've thought about a lot with like, okay, well, if it's the height of the sun, like, why is it not the domicile of the sun? Like, why does the domicile of the sun start in Leo?
Yeah.
Right.
Very interesting.
And I wrestled with that. Like, okay, if it's the height of the sun, why is that important? But really, the sun's role is heat. And heat does not happen at maximum heat does not happen at maximum height. It happens after maximum height because of thermal lag. So objects continue to warm up for an amount of time after after the heat source has been removed. And so if you think about the sun having domicile in the position directly after its height and the sun rejoicing in the house directly after its height in the sky, that's maximum heat. But the moon's job is to reflect light and to reflect, right? Like that's like supposed to be visible. So with the moon, you want maximum height. And in Cancer, if you put the nodes in Aries and Libra, like they're about to do, the North Node in Aries, because if you think about Aries as kind of the north node of the sun, it's where the sun passes our equator and begins moving north. If you put the north node of the moon there, then the moon is only going to be higher and higher and higher than the sun could ever be in that position, to the point that when it gets to Cancer and you have the moon in Cancer, with the north node in Aries, you have this like crazy maximum northern, and it's 5 degrees farther north than where the sun would be. And 5 degrees north is a very visually noticeable phenomena. It's called a lunar standstill when the full moon happens in Cancer, when the nodes are in Aries. So we're going to get one here soon.
Wow.
And it's just because it's so high that it appears almost to like stay still, because it stays at the midheaven for so long, because its midheaven is like so far north. Yeah. So like almost like if you think about in the far northern hemisphere, how the sun doesn't set in that time of year, like the moon will never set during that point, right? Like when it's in Cancer, the moon will just always be in the sky, and it'll be even farther north. So like in those extreme regions, the moon will just be like super visible all day, all night long.
Wow. That's amazing. There's a lot that you just said. So I want to start with the first thing and then kind of go from there. I want to talk about like the sun is or Cancer is the domicile of the sun, and then talk about like the nature of water, and then talk about I think like giving maybe a little description about how the nodes happen, if we can kind of simplify the astronomy a little bit, like to help someone who's like, maybe they're like, okay, I know the nodes are a thing, but like, what the fuck do they mean? So the first thought that comes to mind is, I've never really heard this anywhere else, but I watched Chris's old interview with, I almost said Alan White, who was like the person who kind of, I'll just link it in the show notes. Basically, he was
the lecture,
one of the OG Project Hindsight people, and lectured at NORWAC or at some kind of conference originally, got a lot of people interested in Project Hindsight. And he, in that lecture, puts forward the idea of the moon not having a domicile because of its speed, which I don't particularly like that. But supposing that the night domicile of the sun is Cancer and the day domicile of the sun is Leo. And I've never heard that anyone else talk about that. I don't know where that eventually got dropped or if it did, but it was a very interesting theory to hear. I personally think that like our mother and like the planet of our embodiment and the planet of our nurturance should have a home,
I agree.
But it is really interesting to think of the solstice point, the summer solstice, being that point of the longest day of the year in the northern hemisphere, probably because the sun is the most northern at that point. So we're getting the most daylight. So the sun is kind of like, there's connotations of the sun at maximum strength. And then it's interesting what you said about the term you used in terms of like delays in maximum height in terms of and temperature. And I think
thermal lag.
Yeah. And the term that I learned, I'm thinking back to like high school chemistry, is specific heat, which interestingly, like, and anyone who's kind of been to the beach early in summer will know this, where it's quite hot out, but because of the specific heat of the water or thermal lag or what have you, water takes a long time to heat up compared to the air. And so it's very interesting that the sun is not in domicile in Cancer, partially because Cancer is a cold and wet sign, and the nature of the sun is hot and dry. And so there's this kind of oppositional thing there. And, and it takes that 30 days of the sun at this kind of maximum height and, strong power to kind of for that heat to kind of settle in.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we can even see that in a day where it's like the sun at noon is kind of highest in the sky, but it doesn't get the hottest until like 3 or 4 p.m.
And where does the sun rejoice? The sun rejoices in the ninth, right?
Yeah.
Like at its maximum heat, because that's what it's supposed to do. Is it's supposed to make heat. So like, again, like the concept of astronomy does not void out the concept of astrology. Like these things are explainable and reconcilable like pretty easily, right? Like it's like, oh yeah, that like makes total sense.
Absolutely.
To talk more about Cancer, and so like height I think is really important with Cancer, and just like things reaching their maximum height. I think that is also seen in that we see the exaltation of Jupiter there, and that's like the domicile benefic, or the diurnal benefic, and like getting its exaltation in that sign, in the sign of the sun's maximum height. And so I think that's pretty interesting. I also think I don't have enough thoughts about Sun in Leo, Jupiter in Cancer, I don't have enough thoughts about
It's okay.
that. So, but just thinking about like Jupiter in Cancer as well, forming kind of that Cancer is benefic in nature, and that it is, you know, life creating and life sustaining in nature. And you know, I think that's the moon being the domicile lord, and you know, Jupiter being the exaltation lord. I think that's part of what Cancer is. It's also like, I think, an incredibly protective sign. And I think, you know, if you think about the imagery of the crab, which I was like looking at crabs this morning on the beach, like I think I got this analogy from Austin, is like a crab doesn't take something head on. A crab will like kind of spiral around something. And I think that's kind of in the nature of Cancer, of like, we can like avert things, because we have the ability to like scuttle around them. But that maybe means that the path is longer, because you have to take an arc rather than straightforward. But like, what were you going around is something to consider when you're thinking about Cancer in a chart, is like, what are you going around in Cancer?
Interesting. Yeah, and that evokes the images of like the rotation of the moon around the earth, and you know, or that kind of dual dance of rotations, and how quick the moon is compared to other planets.
And like, as you said, that like the idea that the moon is tidally locked to us, and that like one side of the moon is always facing the earth, right? And that's like what a crab does when it's circling something, like it's facing a center thing. And that, you know, that's important with Cancer, is that like the nature of the moon is that the moon is like always looking directly with her face at us. And that's what that's what Cancer is going to do as well.
Yeah. It's interesting. You evoked another thought that's maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I think it could be illustrative, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts. And I know that you're reading Firmicus for Austin's year 3, and I think I read this in Firmicus where I might have read it somewhere else, but he talks about the rising sign and the sign that's on the eighth, the eighth house from the rising sign, and how like that's the death of that planet. And it's really interesting when you consider Cancer as Jupiter's exaltation, and you consider Cancer being eighth from Sagittarius, which is Jupiter's quote unquote preferred domicile. The moon is kind of like the death of Jupiter, but there's almost like this kind of exaltation in death, and this kind of raising up that the moon does in that place. And that's just really interesting to think about in reference to kind of the natural significations of Jupiter. Like, I feel like there's kind of like a legacy association I get with Jupiter.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, it does have that kind of like, with Jupiter, and that's an interesting, you know, Jupiter kind of throws a wrench into some of the exaltation theories.
Yeah, totally.
Because it's like, okay, well, you know, we understand Venus is sextile, the preferred domicile. You know, Mars is square, the preferred or like, you know, we have this, or Mars is sextile, the preferred domicile, and square, the other domicile, right? So you kind of get this like doubling of Mars things and nocturnal things. But then Jupiter, it's like, okay, well, why are we suddenly going from like with a trine, which is Jupiterian, but why from the nocturnal sign? Why is Jupiter not exalted in Aries, or not Aries? Sorry. Why is Jupiter not exalted in Leo? And, that's something to think about. And definitely, Cancer is kind of like this like death and exaltation. And I think that that's maybe, if you think about like the fortunes of long life, right? Like that could be something that like, Jupiter in the sign of Cancer could bestow and help bestow like a fortunate life, right? Like in a long life. And so there's, exaltation and death because you have the fortune of long life. Yeah. And then, I also think about Sagittarius being sixth from Cancer, and I have the moon and Jupiter both in Cancer together. And I think that there is a real, so like when the moon has Jupiter there, she's still responsible for the domicile, right? And Jupiter is a guest in Cancer who has a lot of pull and, but also takes up a lot of space in Cancer, and Jupiter just in general, like takes up a lot of space. And that is a lot of responsibility, which is like a key word with the moon and with Cancer is responsibility. Like, what are you responsible for? And so like with like, the moon is like constantly having to keep the party going in Cancer. And it's like, but also like the moon needs to sleep. And so like that's part of this, the struggle between the diurnal and nocturnal is like, you have this like combination of these two in Cancer, which in my experience puts a lot of responsibility on the moon to like Jupiter's going to have rowdy party guests. That's in the nature of Jupiter. Jupiter rejoices in the 11th house, and like so there's going to be friends and parties, and that's great, and that's super fortunate, right? Like that's awesome. But also like sometimes your friends like get a little too rowdy and you have to like be the caretaker because of Cancer, because it's Cancer, right? So like the moon, wherever that is, still has to take care of whatever is going on in Cancer. So I also see Cancer kind of as a sign of responsibility in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of the 11th too as like weak ties, and there can be an element of that where it's like if Jupiter's having everyone come over, the moon is kind of like, who the fuck is this person? Like, are you on the guest list? And you know what I mean? It's like, and I think the moon, there's a real intimacy with the moon and a real kind of like one-on-one connection kind of thing with the moon. And so it's interesting of thinking of kind of 11th house tensions with that, or how that can kind of interplay. Yeah. The one thing I wanted to mention before we move on is Jupiter and Venus in the Thema Mundi. And I think her name is Katie Petty. She has written articles and does work with Contra and Tisha and Tisha, and kind of speaks to Contra and Tisha as like of the nature of Jupiter, because Cancer and Sag are connected in that way through this having the same ascensional time. Whereas what is it, Pisces and Libra are connected by Antisha. And that's kind of like the equal amounts of day. And so Antisha is kind of the nature of Venus. So just wanted to throw that out as well as kind of like additional factor in the Thema Mundi, kind of connecting exaltation places to domiciles and what have you with those two planets.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the same ascensional time between Cancer and Sagittarius is like really interesting to me. I've kind of I paused because I started Austin's class, and it wasn't the topic that we're studying. But before I started Austin's class, I was starting to jump into like using the ascensional times as timing. And that's like very interesting that when you think about if you're using them as timing, then things of Cancer and things of Sagittarius are going to come about at the same time of life.
Yeah.
And what does that look like for the native? Like, where are those planets placed? What houses do they rule? So like, that's going to be very interesting to see. And that's just like an interesting way to think about them having the same ascensional time.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I wanted to return to really quickly is the nodes, because you kind of gave an explanation about the moon in Cancer with the node in Aries. And just for listeners who are maybe don't understand what the nodes are and how the ecliptic and kind of the motion of the moon and the sun interplay.
Yeah. So the zodiac is the ecliptic, and that is the path of the sun, and that starts at 0 degrees Aries, which is the spring equinox. So it doesn't line up with the calendar. It's different every year. It's when the sun is conjoined visually to our equator projected out into space, the celestial equator. That's 0 degrees Aries. And then we draw a circle of all of the points that the sun is going to be day after day until it gets back to that equinox point in Aries. And, a circle is 360 degrees, and we can easily divide that into 12 signs, which are 30 degrees each. And that is the ecliptic. The moon orbits us in has its own ecliptic, right? That it is on. And the moon's ecliptic is relatively in line with the sun's ecliptic. It's about 5 degrees tilted from the sun's ecliptic at any given moment. But it has nodal points with the sun's ecliptic, and nodal points are the points at which it's crossing, those two lines intersect. So the path of the moon and the path of the sun intersect. And it's why when they're there at the same time, they eclipse one another, because their paths are intersecting in the sky. And when the moon is crossing its north node, it is moving north, it's moving from south to the north side of the ecliptic. And then when it's at its northern bendings, it'll be at its maximum height. And that's that 5 degrees of celestial latitude farther north. That'll be that 5 degrees north of the ecliptic. And so if the ecliptic from the equator, let's think back to that ecliptic equator, I think it's like a 26 degree tilt from the Tropic of Cancer to the equator, and then down to the Tropic of Capricorn, where the sun is at its maximum north. It's about 26 degrees. So if you think about the moon being able to get 5 degrees off of that, we're talking the moon being a full 30 some degrees away from the equator. So like very, very far north when at the northern bendings in Cancer. And so like that's that point. So long story short, too long didn't read. The nodes are the point at which the path of the moon intersects the path of the sun. And when they're there at the same time, they eclipse one another. But it crosses that path twice a month. And those points are opposite one another. And they move backwards through the zodiac in a 19-year cycle, I think is the timing.
Yeah, we don't have to get into this, but every planet has nodes.
Yep.
Correct? Because every planet has a relationship with the ecliptic.
Yeah, so every planet moves north and south along the ecliptic. They're not just, little choo-choo trains on the tracks. They're kind of bobbing up and down and making loops as they go retrograde. And all of the planets have nodes from a geocentric perspective. So, and those nodes are tied to the motion of the sun in the sky, and they transit along with the planet. And they can be, for these inner planets, they can conjoin one another, and they can be really far apart from one another. And then they also have heliocentric nodes, which is where, if you think about them from the terms of the sun's equator, and it's really interesting because when the sun is on the heliocentric node of a planet, that planet, if it's one of the inner planets, so Mercury and Venus, their nodes will be conjoined at that moment when the sun is at the heliocentric node, which actually is like today, I think, for Venus. I think the sun is like at Venus's north node in Gemini, because the heliocentric north node of Venus is in Gemini.
Wow. Okay. Cool.
So, and that means that the orbit of Venus from our perspective right now looks like a line in the sky. We don't see the hoop. We don't see the front and the back. It just looks like a line. And because Venus is also at like maximum elongation and is past the north node, it's also north of so it's also like very far north, because it's just this line, and it's at kind of the northern tip of the line on its orbit path. So yeah, if you get into Stellarum, which is like a planetarium software that is like free, get into it. You can turn on the orbits of the celestial bodies and the ecliptic. And if you click day by day, you can see how the orbit, like especially Mercury and Venus, they kind of like open up and then close down. If you're looking at like the orbit as a circle of its own. And it's a really interesting phenomenon. And, that's what creates things like you can get transits of Venus of the sun, where Venus will like pass in front of the sun's face. So like the idea of a cazimi, of like being in the heart of the sun, really only happens when the planet is like when the sun is at the planet's heliocentric nodes. Otherwise, the planet's going to be north or south of that, just like the moon, right? Like
where there's longitudinal and latitudinal overlap between the planet and the sun.
Exactly. Just like an eclipse, right? When those two things, otherwise you just get a full moon, new moon, right? The planet goes dark, goes under the beams, or it's, as far away from as the sun as it's going to get, and it gets maximum brightness, just like the moon, right? All planets have that relationship with the sun and the nodes.
And then in terms of the moon in Cancer this summer, this kind of idea of being above the ecliptic is associated with the kind of astrological concept of being out of bounds, correct?
Yep. Yeah. So like being, so planets, if they move farther north than what the sun moves at that point, then they are considered to be out of bounds. So if they move farther north than the maximum north of the sun, which I think is like that 26, if they go farther north than 26 or farther south than 26 south, then they're considered to be out of bounds. Yeah. And that's kind of like, there's lots of resources about what planets at or what the moon at the bendings is
Mhm.
like. And it's like, for me, it's conceptually similar of like the moon, like at a bendings point.
Okay, right on. All right, yeah, let's talk about a little bit more about like your chart and where the moon falls, where Cancer falls. Are you comfortable sharing that information and telling us a little bit about how that impacts your experience of the moon?
Yeah. So I am just barely a Cancer rising. So the moon is in the first sign, and it's pretty conjoined to the ascendant. It's definitely on the ascendant. So yeah, like Cancer rising, moon in the first. But you know, just barely Cancer rising. So I also have Jupiter in Cancer, and Jupiter's in the first sign, and that works out in a lot of ways. But Jupiter's pretty cadent in my chart, like, and you know, depending on the house system, it's like pretty close even to like the 12th house cusp. And so it's, you know, it's right there. And a slight digression about how I use house systems. I'm kind of in an experimental phase, thanks to Stella and Cam's podcast, where they've been reading Rhetorius. So there's a passage in Rhetorius about aspects where he instructs you to take aspects three ways: one zodiacally, two visually or in mundo, and then three by time, temporally. And so if you think about the house cusps as aspects to the ascendant, by whole sign, those are zodiacal aspects to the ascendant. By equal sign, those are exact aspects to the ascendant. By alcobitious, those are visual or in mundo aspects to the ascendant. So like the ninth house cusp in an alcobitious chart is trine visually to the ascendant. And Placidus is about as close as we get to like a temporal system. So like the ninth house cusp in Placidus is a trine in time. So that's a third of the zodiac rising between those 2 points in time. And so I'm kind of experimenting right now with looking at the house systems in all three of those things, like whole sign, alcobitious, and Placidus, so that I get kind of the idea of time, space, and zodiac as as important. But yeah, moon in the first, and it's pretty smack opposite Saturn in the seventh, and also it's separating from Saturn by a few minutes and applying to a trine with Venus and Pisces by a few minutes. So Venus is definitely like rescuing the moon from a pretty rough opposition with a domicile Saturn. And you know, that's a condition that I think is talked about in Ibn Ezra, is the idea of rescuing, where the moon gets something rough happens to the moon, but then applies to something nice right away, before it leaves the sign. And so, yeah, like that's, you know, that's what the moon is doing in my chart, is that it's taking hard opposition from Saturn, which is definitely my early experience in life, is like hard opposition from Saturn, and then applying to Venus, which is exalted in the ninth. And so that's definitely been my path, has been like leaving rigid Saturn things behind and moving toward, you know, I live very far away from the Midwest where my family is and where I was born. So, you know, Lord of the Fourth and the Ninth and the moon applying to that planet, like very much, I live very far away from home, and, you know, like leaving behind old traditions and living a life of kind of comfort, like getting to travel and do those kind of things. Like that's definitely, you know, been my experience. So, yeah.
Love that. Yeah, that kind of speaks to, I think in Demetra's book, she refers to this concept kind of coming from Paulus, where you take the aspects that the moon makes like within 30 degrees. And either way, I'm not sure how 30 degrees back relates to how the life unfolds, but like 30 degrees forward, pretty easy to conceptualize. Like the first degree that the moon makes happens early in life, and kind of it goes on from there. Are there any other aspects that your moon's making like within that 30 degrees that you're maybe coming into like in this phase of your life?
Conjoining the south node, squaring the sun, So yeah, yeah.
Maybe we'll just leave that right there.
Yeah. Scoring Mercury. Uh, yeah, and I mean, it's first quarter moon. That's definitely like I was born the day before the first quarter moon, so the shape of the moon is a crescent, just barely. And yeah, there's definitely like the past couple of years of life have been yeah, a change from things are a little bit on the fuller side, in all forms of life, right? Like things are just a bit fuller, which is, I think definitely, but also, with conjoining the South Node at that point in my chart, like, had to let a lot go in order to get fuller.
Yeah. Cool. I'm just looking at your secondary progressions right now too. And yeah, you are kind of moving into a secondary progressive full moon within the next, you're about 2 signs away still, and the moon.
Yeah. So 6 years or so.
Yeah, a few years. But definitely like a time where light is increasing, energy is increasing. So that's really, really interesting and exciting for you. Look, interested to see kind of what you do in the next few years. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about what your natal lunar phase means. So yeah, we were just talking before we were recording about Gray's Norwalk lecture, and he kind of talks in that lecture about moon phases as they relate to elements and what have you. And so this kind of opening quarter is like of the nature of air, hot and wet, kind of benefic. There's like those seeds that were planted are starting to show with the crescent being visible. And so there's like a lot of potential, a lot of energy, a lot of excitement. I'm interested if you kind of experience it that way, or what other nuances you'd bring in.
Yeah, I think like potential and excitement are like really good keywords. And like that can be double-edged. Like it's great when there's a lot of potential, but what happens when things don't meet their potential? And it's like exciting when there's so much possibility, but you do have to like kind of specify. And I think that's like really of the nature of the moon. I'm thinking back to your Capricorn episode with EY Washington, who I love so much.
Love EY.
And they referenced the Sondheim lyric from Into the Woods, where Cinderella goes to the grave of her mother, and says like, I wish, and Cinderella's mother says like, what do you wish? Specify. Do you know what you wish? Are you certain what you wish is what you want? If you know what you want, make a wish, ask the tree, and you shall have your wish. And she also says that opportunity is not a lengthy visitor, which is like, so like the moon is not a lengthy visitor at any part of the sky, like there for a moment. That aspect of the moon is there for a moment. That amount of light for the moon is going to be different tomorrow night. It's going to be different in a few hours. And it's going to be noticeably different. Like there is absolutely zero permanence with what the moon is doing on its own, which is why, when you think about astrology, we're always looking for the moon to be applying to something. And like the idea of like avoid not being a good time to start things, because there's nothing out there that's kind of anchoring what the moon's potential is, what that potential that the moon has. There's nothing to anchor it into. And so I think that's part of like that moon phase of like that potential excitement, first quarter moon phase. But like it really, like the moon can't do it on its own. It's going to require other things. And that's like hard for the moon, because like the moon is our only body, the Earth's only body. So she has to go like out into space to get help. And yeah, so like that's kind of how I see that first quarter phase, is like one that's exciting and potential and probably needs help.
Interesting. It's interesting thinking about this idea of going out into space versus like the receptive descriptions that can be given to the moon, and how like the moon does receive the rays from kind of these outer planets. It's kind of like almost the idea of like having to take what you can get almost comes,
Yeah. And I think with the light of the moon, like she only has light because of her position in accordance with the sun, right? She can only, and all, like, she doesn't emit her own light. She only reflects. And so, yeah, they're like, there has to be something else to give the moon power, which is interesting.
Yeah. In your own chart, I'm really interested to hear what you think about like cadent planets by degree in the first, because I have a few as well. And I do think that there can be a more internal manifestation of those planets when they're in the first, but cadent by degree, falling from the angle. And I'm wondering if Jupiter being cadent in your first and Jupiter's associations with like buoyancy and stability, as well as being exalted in Cancer, if there adds an element of kind of stability to your own like life or embodiment or identity with that kind of changeable nature that the moon can have.
Yeah, I mean, like I'll be, candid about the privilege that I have, right? Like, my parents had money. I mean, I remember a time when I was little that, like, my dad always worked in the airline industry, which the 90s had like the whole TWA thing happen where, and my dad was caught up in that. So there was like a time when like things were rough. My parents were working class, but like by the time I was like a teenager, like my dad, like things had settled for my parents' careers. My dad had good work. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. Moon in the first in domicile, right? Like I had a stay-at-home mom. It's like, and so like, there was the needs of the physical were definitely being met. But the needs of the spiritual were like very lacking, which is kind of that cadent Jupiter, right? Like I was being fed spiritual things. I went to a private Christian school, but it was a very fundamentalist Christian school, like very right-wing fundamentalist, it was pretty intense. That was at the church that we went to. And so being one of the kids at LCA of the Church of River of Life, you were kind of one of the in crowd, right? You were one of the exalted kids, for lack of a better word. But like, what was I being fed? I was being fed like right-wing propaganda.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, yeah, the physical needs of the body were very met, but like spiritually, I was not being given what I needed. And I had to leave and seek those things out on my own. Which caused a lot of friction with the family, like with, and caused my, and that's where like I had, some of the privilege that I could have had, I released because like it meant giving up a part of myself that I didn't want to give up.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
That feels really resonant astrologically, and that can be a kind of sensitive thing to talk about. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So have you tracked the cycles of the moon in relation to your own emotional life? And if so, what have you found there?
Yeah, I thought about this one a lot because this is one of my frustration points with astrology is that like I'm one of the people, the sign change of the moon, I'm always like, sure. But wow, the phase and wow, the light of the moon really, really does impact me. Like I really do feel that like and I think it's because I have a practice of finding the moon in the sky every single day that I can until it's gone. Like, and then even when it's gone, knowing that it's up there with the sun. I have a practice of like going out and seeing it every single day that I can. And I like, again, like I'm very fortunate that my home has night sky that I can see, the stars and the planets and the moon. So I have this practice, and it's very much like I can feel myself be excited for the full moon as it's happening. And then once it's done, being kind of like, like now it's gonna go away again. Like, and just like, but I don't know, like it's just that is my practice, is just to go see it every day. And if nothing else, just to kind of be like, like it's so beautiful. Like, and I think that's where no moon is a bad moon. because like, have you ever looked at the moon and thought, that's a bad moon? No. Like,
I've never looked up and been like, hey, you're not looking so great today.
Yeah.
It's always like, I love you, you're beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. Even like right now, like Venus in the eighth, like after the sun sets, it's like, am I mad at it? No. Hello. It's like absolutely gorgeous every single night. So that's kind of no moon is a bad moon, because like it's just always like the just like most exciting thing to see whenever you get to see it.
Interesting. This reminds me, not to get all like ascendant ruler in the eighth about it, but this reminds me of how the physical experience of the lights, sun, the moon, the stars, can be really impactful for how we can just live our day-to-day life. And I'm reminded of, I don't really feel this way anymore, but I've made it a habit throughout my life at various times to like watch the sunset. I'm remembering most intensely when I was living in Belgium during college. The sun would set at like 10 p.m. It was really a wild experience.
Yeah.
And I would sit out of my window and just watch it set for like an hour. So much so that like we had like a little courtyard in the building that we lived in, and my like my classmates or whatever would like comment about the fact that I would watch the sunset all the time. But there comes with the sunset, for me, a similar kind of experience, I think, that you're describing about the full moon and the waning of the moon, of like, there's a sadness almost like, okay, the day is gone. We've gone through another one of these cycles. What have I done with this time? What have I made of this day, of this life? And it's just really interesting how that physical reminder of the light setting on the horizon can be like a prompt to, like, it's like almost like I actually have a tattoo of a sun on my arm, and it's I consider it like a memento mori, like a reminder of death, because the setting sun can really be like, okay, our sun is setting. What have we done? What has our life been? And I think that kind of reflection, again, Jupiter in the eighth, Sag rising, it's like, the reminder of death as a way to bring meaning to life and how we kind of structure and live our lives.
Yeah. And I mean, like that's really beautiful. The idea of like the sunset being like the reminder. Yeah. And just like and that's, I think, I just want to say that, I believe that sitting and watching the sunset is practicing astrology. So give yourself credit for doing astrology for maybe a lot longer than what you have, because you sat and you experienced life while observing the celestial body. That is what astrology is. It's observing life while looking at the sky. I think that's all I have to say about that. It's just like that I think really that experience to me speaks to the whole point of it all. Is just like you can sit with your nose buried in the books, and you should understand what's in there, but you should be doing that in a way that is understanding that all you are observing, all you can do is observe the life around you, right? Like that's all that you can do. And so be in awe of the sky. You can't move the planets, but take advantage of them when they're well configured.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add? Do you have any kind of imparting thoughts?
What I didn't get to talk a whole lot about, we didn't really touch on myth. I know you asked it, and then I think I got distracted talking about astronomy, but I do also love mythology. Like, I was also like,
I want to say really quickly, sorry to interrupt, but I think that given what I was just saying about the sun and reminders of mortality, I was struck by how much in Greek mythology in particular, there is this tension between immortality and mortality, where it's kind of like the gods, like the kind of I don't know, like the tension between our mortal lives and the gods being able to just kind of live forever.
Yeah.
And what mortality really means for us as beings.
Yeah. And the story that comes to mind for me is one of those stories where like mortality is a problem for the gods. And that's the story of Prince Endymion, who is like who the moon loved, who had the love of Selene, and but he was mortal. And so there's a couple different ways that the myth goes, but in one of them he's put to sleep into like an eternal slumber, and the moon comes down and like looks upon him as he slumbers at night, which I think is like a very beautiful like kind of story of just sleep, of like you have to sleep so that the moon can look at you and love you. And in other ones he like chooses his eternal slumber so that he can be with the moon, and then is then placed into the sky. But one of the things that I love about that story is there's kind of like a digression, and I think an Ovid text that talks about how the god Pan told Endymion like kind of how to bring the moon down, and gave him like a fleece, like a pure white fleece. And the Ovid text is like because it's kind of like a prayer to Pan, and it's like Pan who like knew how to call the moon down with white fleece, and it's kind of like unknown whether it's like is there this like relationship between Pan and the moon, or is it referencing the story of Endymion who took this fleece and then was able to draw the moon down into the comfort of the fleece. But just like the idea of Pan being involved, Pan as one of the gods who is like origins are a little conflated, but is definitely like a god of the earth, and a god of the wild. And like the moon is a god of the sky, like she's in the sky, but she has this kind of like connection to the earth. And so like I like the connection between Pan and the moon in that story.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a great addition.
Yeah, and I think that's a more than anything, that is to say the moon loves sleep. And right. as a Cancer moon, and I don't think I mentioned this, but like my son's in Taurus, so like you know the light that the moon is reflecting, she's not mad about getting. And so the you know there is something about just a cozy bed and slumber that is very lunar. And I was thinking about how cool it is that sleep is kind of like time travel, because you can just kind of like turn your body off for a few hours and then turn your body back on a few hours later, and like it's a different time. So which is like something that the moon can help us do, because like the moon, again, coming back to like our physical needs, like sleep is one of those things. And so like the moon kind of helps us travel through time in that way.
Yeah, and the moon can also kind of bring us into this world. There's almost a magical element associated with sleep and dreaming where, you know, I'm reminded of like, you know, I don't know if this is like an apocryphal story or what, but Nikola Tesla apparently like going into his dreams and like doing work in his dreams that he maybe couldn't do in the world. And so it's like, yeah, like dreams and dream work can be a particularly like potent magical practice, especially for certain people.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, Jared. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been lovely. Where can we find you? And is there anything that you're working on that you want to let us know about?
So I'm leaping fish, and my website is like leaping.fish. So I'll just plug my website, because my website will have links to my other socials. And that way, like I don't think I've been the victim of any of the scammer things that are out there. But I will just always tell people the easiest way to find me is my website, and that is literally leaping.fish. There's no .com, it's just leaping.fish. And it is, so, you know, you can find all the things. And then I do a podcast, which I haven't posted in a minute just because I haven't, as we mentioned, editing is hard. But that's Triplicity, which I do with my besties, Deja and John. And it's very kind of just like some friends getting together and using astrology as a framework to talk about our lives. That's kind of all it is. And I like to call it, we employ what I like to refer to as the Picatrix method, which is where some of it is bullshit. but it's up to you
to figure it
the
out.
listener to know and to be, wizened enough to know when we're just saying bullshit and know when we're giving you like really interesting information. And if you've read the Picatrix, yeah,
is that real esoteric shit right there.
Yeah, exactly. It's Picatrix in praxis, of just, intentionally putting bullshit out there for the people, essentially, because AI doesn't know.
Right.
AI can't tell because I'm presenting it all the same to them. So
that's so funny. Like how much more I'm reminded of like Manilius and like kind of lyric poetry as like a means of conveying information. And just the ways that we'll kind of have to adapt with AI's scouring of the internet and all information. It's really
exactly. It's great that it can, it's great that it can pull this information up really fast, but just like, like I referenced earlier, check your sources and make sure that they're adequate.
Absolutely. All right. Wonderful. Jared, thank you so much again for being here. This has been wonderful. And we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Talk soon. Thanks.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.